This video is sponsored by World Anvil. Can you play a D&D character who doesn't believe in the gods? I've seen this topic come up a few times, and whenever it does, there's always an obvious rebuttal. No, it doesn't make sense, because unlike religions in our world, the gods of a D&D world are verifiably real. They give clerics and paladins magic powers. But this argument doesn't change the fact that, for a lot of players, this is a concept they want to explore in their D&D characters. So today we're going to talk about how you can create a D&D character who is a non-believer, and still have that make sense in a world where divine magic is a thing. This video was commissioned by one of my Patreon supporters, Thinks He Can Dance. That's their username, I'm not being a jerk. This topic came up after LegalKimchi made his excellent video about rethinking religion in your games, which is directed towards game masters and offers advice for how to make religion make more sense in your game world, since the way we see faith expressed in most D&D worlds is kind of a bunch of nonsense. I'm paraphrasing, that would be a buck wild way for Kimchi to describe something. His video is fantastic, the link is in the description, go watch it if you haven't, because this video is kind of a counterpart to his video. You don't need to watch his video to understand this one, I just think you need to watch his video straight up. But while he addressed what game masters can change from a world building and storytelling perspective, for this video we're going to tackle the topic of religion in D&D from a different angle, focusing on what players can do individually to enrich our experience of the game, specifically by questioning the role the gods play in the world. Also, before we begin, a quick disclaimer. We're all going to be cool about this one, right? We're going to be talking about real-world religion more than a little bit, and my goal is to be as respectful as possible when discussing this subject. We're also going to talk about morality, philosophy, and tropes and trends in fiction. If I get something wrong or characterize something in a way that seems less than charitable, let me know in the comments. I'd like to know where you feel I missed the mark. But try to remember that my goal is to handle this with respect, so any errors are accidental. My goal isn't to upset, insult, or harm anyone. I also know that comment sections can get kind of dicey, so if you're going to discuss any of this down below, let's please be respectful of each other. So first we're going to talk about why you might want to play a non-believer in a D&D game, and then we'll talk about how you can make that make sense in the world of a game like D&D. There are basically two forms of non-believer you could play in D&D. Either your character believes the gods are not actually gods, like they claim to be, believing that they may simply be powerful entities but not that they're actually divine, or you fully don't believe the gods exist at all. These two beliefs are pretty different when it comes to how you can rationalize them within the world of the game, but like I said, we'll explore the how later on. Because to figure out the how, first you have to make sure you understand the why. Now, whichever version you go with, I think there is a possible motive that works for either one. D&D players love to be the exception to the rule. Is everyone in the party playing wizards? Somebody wants to play a warlock or an eldritch knight. Playing an evil campaign? Somebody wants to be neutral, even just good and caught up with a bad crowd. And if everyone in the world believes in the gods and stuff, well, sometimes someone's gonna want to play someone who doesn't fit in with everyone else. I ain't gonna be part of your system. Obviously, I'm not saying that any real-world atheists or agnostics are just being contrarian. That would be enormously reductive. And more to the point, I also don't believe that any players who play a unique character are just being contrarians either. Coming up with a way that your character can be the exception is a really excellent way to give your GM a way to engage your character in the story without necessarily having to write a whole elaborate backstory. If your character marches to the beat of a different drum, that can inform how they move through the world, which can present itself in interesting ways in every single session. You might not even need a dedicated session or story arc to satisfy you, because any interaction with an NPC could bring out what makes your character unique, which gives you a chance to roleplay your character. And like I said, this works for either example, where your character believes the gods are basically frauds, or manipulators, or whatever, or where they fully don't think the gods are real at all. But there are other possible reasons to play through each of these ideas as well. So let's start with the latter, a character who doesn't even think the gods exist. When I first started running 5th edition, we were playing through Horde of the Dragon Queen, and one of my players rolled up a character who didn't believe in the gods. Basically, if somebody mentioned the gods, his character would say, well, come on, you don't think the gods are actually real, do you? However, he also wanted to play someone who thought dragons were myths. I suspect these choices were inspired by the fact that it was 2015. Game of Thrones was in its 4th season, the show was just getting better and better, it was never going to embarrassingly crash and burn. But that show took place in a fantasy world where most people didn't believe in dragons or magic, or at least thought they were long gone from the world. This player was playing a bard, so not believing in magic wasn't going to be possible, but he could transplant that concept onto the gods instead. However, this was exactly the wrong campaign to try to play that character, because you see a dragon at level 1, so it really doesn't give you a chance to explore the full depths of that character, where they gradually see more and more fantastical stuff happening in the world, and they have to accept that there's more going on in the world than they had previously imagined. Now, I want to be perfectly clear. You might not want to roleplay that character arc. You might just think that playing an atheist in a world of non-believers will lead to interesting conflict, but you're not looking to have your character's mind changed. Or maybe you just don't think the way religion works in D&D makes a lot of sense, and this is your way of reconciling that. Or maybe you want to play someone who is skeptical to the point of absurdity, like the kind of character who sees spells being cast but is constantly looking for the truth behind it. Actually, that would be a super fun character, like one of those magician debunkers, but they live in a D&D world, and so any attempt to explain the magic they see is just completely nonsensical. But I do think that we, as D&D players, model a lot of our ideas off of the stories we see in movies and TV. And if you look at those examples, you'll find that most of the time, if a character is presented as a stubborn non-believer, then it's actually there as setup so they can gain belief later in the story.
I don't believe in magic, a lot of superstitious hocus pocus. Going after a find of incredible historical significance. You're talking about the boogeyman.
Marion, don't look at it. Shut your eyes, Marion. Don't look at it no matter what happens.
Every single person that you or I has ever known is dead! Dead! There is no God. There is no God.
Open the door, please.
What are you doing?
I'm listening.
You have the sacred mark.
Well, that? No, I got slapped on me when I was in an orphanage in Cairo.
That mark means you're a protector of man, a warrior for God, a magi.
Sorry. With the wrong guy.
By the way, if you're an atheist in real life, you probably don't love the fact that most of the time when atheists are depicted on screen, they're learning a lesson that being a skeptic is bad, actually. Granted, we're focusing on genre fiction since it maps much better onto the types of adventures we tell in D&D, and so it would be a bit strange if somebody remained a non-believer when there are obviously magical things happening in these stories. But that's kind of my point, right? It seems to me like if you're going to play someone who fully doesn't believe the gods exist at all, then the most natural conclusion to that storyline is discovering that they are, in fact, real. Or at the very least, the character learns to make their peace with the fact that they don't have all the answers.
That creature, what was it?
I don't know. Never did decipher that writing. But that's good. Okay, I know everything. Might as well stop.
What do you think it was? Really?
I think we beat it. That's good enough for me.
It can be tough to admit that you don't have all the answers. Even as a GM, I sometimes have to pretend I know more than I actually do, and hide the stuff I don't want my players to learn yet behind riddles and indecipherable writing. But if you're a GM and you want to make it seem like you know exactly what you're doing, then check out today's sponsor, World Anvil. World Anvil is a fantastic resource that makes world building easier than ever. One of the biggest challenges when I'm world building is straight up just trying to remember what I've already established and trying to keep track of all my ideas in a consistent place rather than spreading them around between a bunch of different places, like apps and notebooks and Google Docs and emails sent to myself. I'm in the early stages of creating a new campaign setting, so I'm making a conscious choice to record all of my ideas in one place, exclusively using World Anvil as the record for this world. And it is really nice to be able to know not just where I can find anything I've created for my setting, but also to know that I hardly have to do anything to make it look presentable and ready to share with my players. And World Anvil is offering a discount to the viewers of this channel. If you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you can save 51% off of any annual membership. Yes, you heard me right, 51%, that's more than half off. Once again, that's worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thank you so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. But now let's turn our attention to the other version of a non-believer in D&D. A character who believes the gods are real beings, but for whatever reason doesn't believe they're worthy of worship. This could be because they think they're not really gods, or because they are, but they still aren't worthy of worship. More on that later. I ran a poll on YouTube a few months ago asking participants if anyone in their games had either played someone who didn't respect/trust the gods, or someone who didn't think the gods were real at all. And obviously this is not a thorough poll of the community. I only got about 1,800 replies, so it was hardly a representative sampling of my entire audience. But still, overwhelmingly, it seems like a lot more people have played characters who didn't think the gods were worthy of trust and or respect, rather than play someone who didn't believe the gods existed at all. A few commenters said their characters believe the gods are just powerful wizards who have declared themselves gods. Some have said that a character in their party simply believes the gods are useless and pathetic. And some have acknowledged that the gods might indeed be powerful cosmic beings, but that doesn't mean that they're deserving of worship. And this is interesting because we can obviously find examples in pop culture of characters who hold this viewpoint, and then usually they're challenged and they grow and change. But unlike our first example, there's more than one version of this arc. It's possible for a character to have great distaste for the higher powers in their story, but then they learn some other lesson. It might not change how they feel about the gods, but instead they change in other meaningful ways, like just learning not to be selfish.
He is with us nonetheless.
2 of your boys are already dead. How much faith do you have left, Father? So where the hell's your God now?
Never had a doubt.
That is my God, Mr. Riddick.
Or maybe they learned that the powers that be weren't as bad as they thought, or at the very least, can be worked with to some degree, even if they still don't like the overall setup.
I guess God has a plan for all of us.
God's a kid with an ant farm, lady. He's not planning anything. I guess there's a plan for all of us. I had to die. Twice. Just to figure that out.
But the difference here is that I don't know if this has quite so obvious a conclusion as I don't believe the gods even exist. In that case, the characters will be challenged by seeing things they don't believe, and they'll have to come to terms with it. But in this scenario, you as a player don't have to know what your character is going to do when they learn more about the gods, or interact with the members of the gods' organized religions, or the clerics or paladins who serve them. Your GM doesn't have to have a plan for what arc your character will experience. This concept lends itself naturally to a story of discovery, because the end of your arc is guided by the events of the campaign, particularly how your character interacts with the religious institutions they encounter. Playing someone who believes that the gods exist but that they're not worthy of worship also puts you into the shoes of playing a skeptic. Maybe your character has philosophical reasons for their lack of belief. I mean, the question of why do bad things happen to good people is an evergreen example of a seed of doubt that so often acts as a gateway for questioning the concept of a god or a group of gods that are supposedly omnipotent. Or maybe your character has a distrust of authority. This could mean a distrust of the leaders of an organized religion, we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the video, or a distrust of any so-called gods who might claim to have any such authority over others. Or if you just don't want to go that deep with it, you could just play your character as a kind of crackpot conspiracy theorist. Because whenever this topic comes up in the D&D discourse, that is the parallel that always gets brought up eventually. So on that note, let's shift away from why you might want to play a non-believer and discuss how you could play a non-believer in a D&D world. How can you play a character who internally makes sense, yet believes in something that so clearly is contrary to the way most D&D worlds are designed? As I alluded to earlier, whenever this topic comes around again in the D&D themed corners of social media, someone always points out that it's basically insane that someone would not believe in the gods if they lived in a world where divine magic was actually verifiable and real. It would be the equivalent of being a flat earther. And I actually think we need to break down a bunch of assumptions that get wrapped up in this statement. First of all, as I mentioned, if you want to lean into this interpretation, you can. You can just play a kook who believes in something that you know is ridiculous. Flat earthers do exist despite all the evidence that flies in the face of their insane belief system. And so, if you don't mind your character being the butt of the joke, then you could play a D&D conspiracy theorist. Keep an eye out for how your fellow players respond to that sort of roleplay. Making follow the money jokes isn't going to be funny at every table because some people have had very different experiences with conspiracy theorists in real life. But if that's all you want to do with the character, play this belief as a joke that you're in on as a player, and that everyone at the table can laugh along with you about, then go for it. However, I disagree with the assumption that this is the only way to play this belief, or lack of belief, in a D&D game. First of all, whenever we talk about the world of D&D and we talk about something that everyone would know about, it's important to remember that we are living in the first era in human history where you can pull up any information you want just by rubbing your hands all over your pocket rectangle. If you scan back a bit, you'll find that it's not at all uncommon for people to have wildly different beliefs based on what they've been told. I mean, Obviously, that's still true today. There are people living in our world who still believe that everyone who got a COVID shot is going to turn into a zombie at some point. And so just imagine how opinionated people must have been before we all had a piece of glass that could give us all the right answers if we just ask it all the right questions. I'm not even saying that we have to go back to ancient Greece and discuss how many people actually believed in the gods or centaurs or dryads, or go back to medieval times and debate how many people actually believed in dragons or fairies. We can just go back to the 90s to see this in action. Because if you grew up in the 2000s or the 2010s, you might not realize how many people used to genuinely believe in Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster. These weren't just wild conspiracy theories. These weren't just the things that got printed on the cover of the Weekly World News like Bat Boy. There were plenty of people who were perfectly normal in every way, except that they also believed in one or more cryptids. I'm not trying to belittle this belief. I'm sure some people do still believe in them. But the number of believers dropped a lot once we all had cameras in our pockets, because suddenly, we could get high-resolution images the second we saw something hinky. As a result, all those blurry photos were suddenly replaced by clear photos that removed a lot of the ambiguity you used to get from these shots. Camera phones basically killed Bigfoot and Nessie sightings. Going back to my friend who played a non-believer bard, if we had been on the same page about how common dragon sightings are, then it absolutely could have worked for this character to be skeptical about dragons. Heck, even if he'd played someone who was basically from the Shire in Lord of the Rings, it might be totally reasonable for that character to think all the stories about dragons are made up. It's even possible for them to doubt that Gandalf is an actual wizard, and doubt that magic is even real. And while going that far probably wouldn't have worked for that specific character, since, like I mentioned earlier, that character was playing a bard, so they kind of do need to believe in magic, we could extrapolate a similar scenario for divine magic. Maybe this bard had never seen a priest cast a healing spell, and so any rumors they've heard of priests who can heal with a single touch, this bard just assumes is folklore or straight up religious propaganda. But this begs a question. How common is healing magic in the world of the game? This is tough because it's something that the player can't necessarily answer. It's in the hands of the GM. It also has a lot to do with how common adventurers are in the world, as well as how common support spells are in your games. And I've made videos about both of those topics, the links are in the description below. This is an issue with high magic worlds like the Forgotten Realms or Exandria from Critical Role. It's kind of taken as a given that any priest working out of any temple can at least cast some healing magic. But that also depends on how common healing magic is in different parts of the setting. As LegalKimchi says in his video,
to your farmer outside the major city of Baldur's Gate, a healing cleric may be as rare as a physician to a farmer in the 13th century French countryside.
And so your character either needs to come from a small town where they've never actually seen anybody cast any healing spells, or they have to have their own theory for why priests can heal people, because clearly they don't believe it's power granted to them by the gods. Sure, that's the canonical explanation according to the rules of the game, but is it the only possible explanation? Well, of course not. And we already know that it's not. Druids and rangers and bards can all learn healing magic, and none of those classes are dependent on belief at all, let alone belief in a higher power. Actually, clerics and paladins aren't even dependent on a higher power. That's just the assumption from the fact that it's a priest casting a healing spell in a temple, but you could play a cleric or a paladin who's not dedicated to a god, so potentially that could be true for the priests working out of temples as well. Like, what do we know? This also brings me to the next thing I want to talk about when it comes to a lack of belief in the gods of D&D. I see so many people argue that being an atheist doesn't make any sense in a D&D game because the people can see concrete evidence of the gods being real. Unlike our world, the gods of D&D are clearly, obviously, verifiably real, and they have a visible impact on the world. But this interpretation kind of vastly understands how religion has worked throughout, like, all of human history. Yes, right now, faith and science are more or less divorced from each other, although they don't have to be at odds with each other. The existence of science does not automatically disprove faith.
Let's say you're God.
Joan, I am God.
Okay, well, let's see a miracle.
How about that?
That's a tree.
Let's see you make one.
But you're right, in our modern world, we mostly understand how science works, and we don't look to faith to explain things that we don't understand. We look to science and we try to find a rational explanation. Except that's not true. Sure, it's true generally. It's true about where we are as a society. Maybe. I don't know. It's kind of hard for me to have lived through the past couple of years and claim that we as a society respect science, but I do think that culturally people expect science to offer answers. But on an individual level? Well, sometimes weird stuff happens and some people just shrug their shoulders and say, hey man, I cannot figure out how that could have happened. I think it was Jesus. I don't say that to be dismissive in the slightest. I do that too. In his video, LegalKimchi offers some excellent examples of real-world miracles that have been observed and recorded in the modern day. But if you hadn't already guessed, I communicate mainly through movie clips, so this debate just makes me think of this scene.
This was divine intervention. That means that God came down from heaven and stopped the bullets?
That's right. That's exactly what it means. God came down from heaven and stopped these motherfucking bullets. What happened here was a miracle, and I want you to fucking acknowledge it.
There are always going to be limits to our understanding of the world around us. And throughout a good deal of history, religion was considered to be the answer for the unexplained. The ancient Greeks didn't know about positive or negative electrons, so they didn't know why lightning happened. So they came up with a story that made sense to them. There was a dude up there who literally just made lightning bolts, and another dude who just sent them down to Earth. That was the best explanation they had. They didn't know that the Earth got closer and farther from the sun at different times of the year, so they didn't know why seasons happened. So they figured that spring must literally leave the mortal world for half the year, probably to go hang out with her goth husband. That was how they made sense of the world. That didn't make them dumb or gullible. In fact, I'd argue they were still using the scientific method. They were simply limited in what they could actually literally observe. As an example, let's say that you live in ancient Rome, although you would just call it Rome, and you believe in a god of fire. We'll call him Vulcan. And then one day, out of nowhere, a mountain explodes. You have no idea why. You've never seen a mountain explode. No one has ever heard of a mountain exploding, at least as far as you know. So, based on what little evidence you have, what is the only reasonable conclusion for you to draw?
The great god Vulcan must be enraged.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense given the evidence in front of you. What else could it even be? Now, it's unreasonable for most D&D groups to assume that their characters don't understand the scientific reasons behind natural phenomena like storms and seasons and volcanoes. Unless your group all agrees to that during character creation, which could be fun, but that's a lot to ask. And honestly, you don't need to go that far. Your characters can just know some fundamental middle school science, that's fine. Some scientific knowledge is not necessarily incompatible with a fantasy world.
Can your science explain why it rains?
Yes! Yes, it can!
But in a D&D world, the gods might not exist to explain where natural scientific phenomena come from, although they totally could. Sometimes you can just have a god of the sun or a god of storms. But what I mean is, the magic spells cast by clerics and priests and paladins can essentially sub in for those unexplained aspects of the natural world. Some people can just do healing magic and they think it's being caused by their faith, and in absence of any better explanation, who's to say that's not the case? Well, your character might not agree. They might not see a difference between what a druid does and what a cleric does. Just because someone believes they get their power from a god or a higher power doesn't mean they're correct.
Where'd you pick up the new skills? I was given a gift. I believe it's a sign that our path is a righteous one.
Your character might believe that some people can cast what's considered divine magic, but not believe that it's actually a gift from a god. That being said, it is possible that during the course of the campaign, something will happen that will be impossible to deny. Something that is very clearly evidence of the divine. In his video, LegalKimchi interviews Ed Greenwood, the creator of the Forgotten Realms, and Ed explains that he wanted the gods to be more mysterious and unknowable, and for there to be doubt about whether or not they were even real. He didn't win that battle. And my guess is that's because the power scaling of D&D, as well as some of the myths we're drawing on, especially Journey into the Underworld stories, made it inevitable in many campaigns that the characters would wind up encountering the gods. So the gods would essentially have to be defined and confirmed to be real in the world of the game, if only so the players have something to do at higher levels. And when your skeptic character literally witnesses the divine occurring, it's possible that continuing to deny it won't make any sense. This is kind of the issue with the Indiana Jones franchise. I played the clip earlier where we see that Indy says that he doesn't believe in magic, and yet the next movie in the series, Temple of Doom, is a prequel, and it ends with Indiana Jones evoking the name of Shiva in order to basically cast a spell that burns the bad guy with holy magic. This kind of breaks the franchise. Now anytime something weird happens, Indiana Jones shouldn't be surprised, right? Who exactly is Indy to call the Holy Grail a fairy tale when he's experienced at least 2 major supernatural events in his life so far? Believe it or not, the latest movie, Dial of Destiny, actually gave me the moment that I'd been looking for from this franchise for a long time. How can Indiana Jones continue to be the same character and be a skeptic at the beginning of every movie without being an idiot who ignores what's right in front of his eyes?
I don't believe in magic, Wombat. But a few times in my life I've seen things. Things I can't explain.
So it's not that Indiana Jones is a dunce, it's that he sees something and it says, well, okay, I don't know what I just saw, I'm not sure what I believe. And then he leaves it at that. And while I'm not totally sure that that works with the ending of Raiders of the Lost Ark, considering that movie is kind of about Indiana Jones learning to open his heart to faith, it does work with the larger franchise overall, where he keeps learning the same lesson over and over about believing in the unbelievable. Also, as that scene continues, his next line is especially useful for our purposes today.
And I've come to believe it's not so much what you believe, it's how hard you believe it.
I mean, that is literally how clerics and paladins work. So if you want to play someone who doesn't think the gods exist, or at least isn't sure, this might be your answer. Sure, the cleric thinks they're getting their power from a god, but they don't have to be right. They just have to believe hard enough, and that in and of itself is enough to manifest divine magic. Okay, but what if your character doesn't believe the gods don't exist at all, but just doesn't think the gods are worthy of worship or respect? I would actually argue that this is a lot easier to justify than not believing the gods even exist. Again, as LegalKimchi points out in his video,
in a world where you can become a god, what makes a deity worth worship? It feels more like worshipping a CEO of a company or the leader of a nation than something divine.
Of course, as we've seen in our world today, some people do worship CEOs or political leaders. Terminally online people will bend over backwards to explain how Elon Musk is actually playing 4D chess, when in reality he's an idiot who made a terrible business decision by buying Twitter and continues to run it into the ground because he's an ignorant dipshit. Some people genuinely believe that Donald Trump was sent by Christ to save America because you know how Christ famously loves racism and adultery? Also, earlier we touched on the question, why do bad things happen to good people if the gods are all powerful? This is an especially relevant question in a world like D&D where there are ancient liches and evil gods trying to conquer or destroy the world, and the gods presumably don't want that to happen. So that begs the question, why don't the gods just intervene and make that problem go away? This is also a world-building question that your GM has to grapple with, but as a player, you don't have to have an answer. However, it does mean that your characters might have some strong feelings about the gods, and how much power and influence you think they might actually have. Again, going back to that poll, there were a few respondents who said that their characters essentially think of the gods as useless. After all, if the gods need the heroes to solve their problems for them, then they might not have any real power of their own, since they apparently can't handle the situation that a handful of mortals can. A handful of mortals who were probably clearing giant rats out of a basement just a year or two earlier. This is fairly similar to some of the sentiments we've seen Keyleth express on Critical Role. Sure, the beings we know of as the gods clearly have some power, she doesn't deny that. But the player characters also have a ton of power, and that doesn't make them gods. Well, okay, a famous quote from later in the campaign might make that a very funny claim to make, but maybe this is a better way to phrase it. The party doesn't expect anybody to worship them. And this segues nicely into the other way that we can imagine a character's feelings towards the gods. Full-on hatred of them. The character believes the gods exist and may even believe that they're really gods, but they think the gods suck.
They call it the balance. I call it hypocritical bullshit.
Because you do not believe in God does not mean God does not believe in you. Someone can spend half their life in a slam with a horse bit in their mouth and not believe? Think he could start out in some liquor store trash bin with an umbilical cord wrapped around his neck and not believe? Got it all wrong, holy man. I absolutely believe in God. And I absolutely hate the fucker.
If hell is forever, then heaven must be a lie.
Emily.
If angels can do whatever and remain in the sky, the rules are shades of gray when you don't do as you say, when you make the wretched suffer just to kill them again.
Come on what other D&D channel are you going to get that level of tonal whiplash? Now, no matter how your character feels about the gods, even if they're 100% on board with them and they're actually devout worshippers, it's still completely reasonable for your character to distrust members of an organized religion. Early in Critical Role's Vox Machina campaign, Keyleth had a lot of conflict with Lady Kima, a paladin of Bahamut. She essentially seemed to think that Lady Kima was using her belief in her own destiny and higher purpose as a way to dismiss any wrongdoing on her part. And indeed, when the party had first met Lady Kima a few episodes earlier, fully half of the party did not trust her, or at least would have chosen their other companion over her. Now, their other companion was a mind flayer who ate brains, so if you didn't think that was a good call, fair enough. History's on your side on that one, actually. And if you think it's weird that Keyleth is so antagonistic to someone who was just tortured for days, again, fair enough. But I've seen a lot of comments from people who just don't understand why Keyleth specifically, or Vox Machina generally, wouldn't trust a paladin of a good god. And first of all, even if you agree with someone's morality, that doesn't mean that they can't make mistakes. I mean, I guess if you're Catholic, you do think one specific guy can't make mistakes, but I don't think it's reasonable to assume that the same grace extends to every paladin of every good god. But also, again, even if you share the religion of another person, that doesn't mean you agree with their interpretation of that religion. Now again, people will argue that in D&D, religion isn't like our real-world religions. In D&D, people can literally cast spells to talk to their gods. This is very similar to the argument that the gods in D&D are different from gods in our world because they have a tangible impact on the world, which, again, pretty severely misunderstands how people practice their faith. There are absolutely people in the world, from history into the present day, who either believe that they hear God, or at the very least, believe someone in their faith can commune with God directly. Again, looking at Catholicism, they have a guy who makes the rules for how Christianity works because they are essentially God's representative here on Earth. That's a pretty big part of that religion. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying, but that's basically the gist of how the Pope works. And yet, if you're familiar with a few pretty important historical figures, you'll know that there were a few people who absolutely shared the faith of their fellow Catholics, yet they wildly disagreed with the actions of the Church, and even the Church's interpretations of the holy texts.
As for myself, the priests assured me that by gazing at sacred relics, I could cut down my time in purgatory. Luckily for me, Rome had enough nails from the Holy Cross to shoe every horse in Saxony. But there are relics elsewhere in Christendom. 18 out of 12 apostles are buried in Spain.
Again, regardless of where you land on the subject of Christianity and Catholicism, you cannot deny that there has famously been some dissent in the ranks. And again, you want to talk about a difference between the people running the religion and the people practicing the religion? Martin Luther, that's who the guy was in the clip, by the way, that's Martin Luther. Martin Luther did not want people who followed his teachings to be called Lutherans. Yet, speaking as somebody who was raised Lutheran, it kind of seems like he lost that battle. And of course, the argument that you couldn't reasonably distrust a paladin or another holy follower of a good-aligned god in the D&D pantheon ignores one of my favorite tropes. The zealot. The person who believes so strongly that they are righteous that they're willing to do horrible things for what they perceive to be the greater good.
I'll bring you pain. I'll bring you horror. So that you may rise above it. So that those of you who survive this reign of hell on earth will be worthy of God's love.
Why would I wish the mask destroyed?
It is evil. It must be destroyed for the glory of your goddess.
It is for the glory of our goddess that we shall wear the mask.
I was also going to include a clip of Judge Frollo from Hunchback of Notre Dame, but I'm already tempting the copyright gods enough with this video, plus most of his scenes include a slur for the Romani people, but, you know, enough said with this guy, right? I hope it's not hard for you to understand how this dude is both a devout follower of his religion, yet also utterly evil, without the other characters or the film itself condemning his religion as a whole. These clips of these characters are exactly why I've never understood the argument that Vox Machina should have trusted Lady Kima without question. I'm not saying she was wrong, but if you ignore someone's red flags just because they're a member of a religious institution, well, I mean, throughout history that has been kind of a bad idea. But also, assuming that all priests and paladins are trustworthy is just a lot less dramatic than the alternative. Regardless of how your character feels about the gods, I think it's perfectly reasonable to be a bit skeptical of the NPCs you encounter, especially the ones who have some amount of societal power. Ultimately, this video is not about giving you the right answers for how you should roleplay your relationship with the gods of the world, because there is no one right answer. I did want to debunk a few arguments I've seen over the years that I just fundamentally disagree with, but I want to be clear. I disagree with them because I find them either unconvincing or undramatic. If you have an idea that resonates with you and it sounds like it's something that I think is a bad idea, then what do I know? I'm not at your table. The goal is to get you thinking about the ways you can roleplay a character with some sort of opinion about the gods besides just, these are the gods and I don't feel particularly strongly about them. I wanted to focus on the idea of playing a non-believer because it's where I've seen the most discourse on this subject, but let me know in the comments below if there's some other aspect of this subject that you'd like to see me talk about in a future video. Of course, you can always commission a future video by signing up for my Patreon or my Ko-fi or my YouTube memberships. I have added goals to my Ko-fi, so you should be able to get rewards there just like you could for Patreon or YouTube memberships. Please make sure to like and subscribe, ring the bell, join my Discord server, and sign up for my mailing list. All those links are in the doobly-doo below. My last couple of videos have all been about religion and D&D, so make sure to check out my most recent one here. It's a really good one, and it took forever to make. Until next time, play fair, and have fun.